Hi, it's Vera. Welcome to the PL Pod second season, episode 4, featuring David Bingham of Ironbridge, Telford. David's poetry collection, The Chatter of Crows, was published by Office Press in October 2014. He was the winner of the British Haiku Society International Haibun Prize in 2017, and he's read his work in art centers, pubs, theaters, on local radio, and poetry and literary festivals. His most recent readings have been at City Voices in Wolverhampton, Country Voices in Shropshire, and as a member of Greenwood Haiku at the British Haiku Society International Haiku Conference in St. Albans in June 2019. As part of the humorous poetry double act Bingham and Woodall, he has performed at the Wolverhampton Lit Fest and comedy festivals in 2017 and 2018. David's poetry appears regularly in a wide variety of magazines, including Blythe Spirit, Time Haiku, and Presence, and anthologies including the Wenlock Poetry Festival, anthologies for 2012, 14, 15, and 16, and Beyond Words 2018. And Where Silence Becomes Song, the International Haiku Conference anthology for 2019. At different times, he was the editor of both Borderlines and Blythe Spirit magazines and was a joint editor of Ripening Cherries, the Office Press anthology of haiku, tanka, and haibun published in October 2019, and editor of Stories Under Every Rock, an anthology of haibun published by the British Haiku Society in 2020. Now, you may think you know a lot about David Bingham at this point, but when he's read a few of his poems to you, you'll know even more. Welcome, David.
Hi, Vera. Hi.
I'm so happy to welcome you to the podcast. For listeners, we met through a Zoom reading hosted by Office Press in England called International Voices. International Voices pairs a UK local, I will use that phrase loosely, and someone from offshore. So David and I read together at the end of June, and I thoroughly enjoyed the experience. Now, as a poet, David, who writes haiku, senryu, haibun, Western poetry, can you give listeners a glimpse into your approach to each? I mean, do you wait for the muse to show up?
Well, I find that with haiku and poetry, I have different approaches. With haiku, I'm always on the lookout. Everywhere I go, I take my haiku notebook with me. And we're not so much searching for, expecting is that haiku moment, a moment of revelation. And they happen, maybe I'll go out, nothing happens. Another day, I might have 2 or 3 haiku moments. And when I actually have these haiku moments, I jot down immediately in words the experience. And it can be something I've heard, something I've seen, something I've tasted, sort of sense experiences, but also intuitive experiences. And when I come to write them up later, but with a haiku, they're almost written up. But when I come to edit them later, and it's always light touch editing that I go for, I don't strictly use 5-7-5, the form, but I tend to be quite traditional and use the 3 lines. But people get hung up on the idea of the haiku as being 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, whereas the actual essence of a haiku is the cut, or what the Japanese call the kirigi. And that's putting 2 sense images together to create a spark, a bit like a spark plug. It sort of fires between the 2 images. And in doing this, you try and recreate for the reader that moment, that exciting moment of revelation that you experienced. With poetry, I find things are slightly different. And I tend to compare the differences being the difference between fishing and farming. When you're out with haiku, the bait is cast out and maybe nothing will happen. You'll sit there on the riverbank and nothing will happen. Another day, you'll catch 2 or 3 fish. But with poetry, you can be working on a project. You can be writing about your childhood experiences. It could be something to do with history. It could be something to do with folklore. It could be something to do with nature. They could be ongoing projects, but also you do have those moments of inspiration. I mean, I had one this morning, actually. I was sitting here and the idea came to me. I was working on the computer and I had the mouse in my hand. And the idea came to me of never underestimate a mouse. And I had this idea of a mouse coming out of the skirting board, crawling up onto my desk and snuggling under my hand. And then just by caressing the mouse, things begin to happen. The world changes. All the world of the computer becomes different. 1 minute you can be reading poetry, the next minute you could be looking at a car crash. And then the mouse crawls away from your hand and it goes back into the skirting board. Now, this is surreal nonsense, but it's that sort of idea which then leads to a poem. And the difference then is get it down, get the first draft down. And, you know, I always have my writer's journal. I've got writer's journals going back years with ideas like that. And I'm never stuck because I'm never stuck for inspiration because there's always something there for me to go back to. But it's always best to strike while the iron is hot. And then there are the drafts, first draft, second draft, third. Never throw them away. Always keep your drafts. And when you think you've finished, when you think you've edited to a final point, as Confucius says, put it in a drawer for 7 years and then come back to it. I don't do it for 7 years. I do it for a month and come back to it, final edit, then send it off. So they're very different approaches. And the tools, which I won't go into because we haven't time here now, the tools for writing poetry are very, very different. And the eventual products are very, very different.
That's true. Although, you know, in the US, I went to a Zoom workshop because the world's wide open right now. And one of the points of emphasis was how to bring the poetic devices into a haiku.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting process that he had. His name was Brad Bennett.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. One of the things that I find is that people say a poetic device like metaphor, not to use metaphor in haiku. Similarly, not to use simile in haiku, heightened language, straightforward, simple language in haiku. But what happens, I find, is that a haiku, when it's well written, can become a metaphor. So the metaphor isn't explicitly stated in the haiku, but the haiku itself is the metaphor.
Well, and I think that's the instinctual writing of haiku. You see this moment, you see what's happening, and you transfer that to someone else's mind. And in that, you have given them your impression of what's happened there. And it's such a beautiful event. Writing haiku for me is such a happy moment. That haiku moment is one of my favorite moments.
Yeah.
When I nail it.
Yeah.
Because they're not always easy. And do you find it hard to transition from, say, one kind of poetry? Do you devote days to or times of day to certain kinds like haiku or haibun, and then another time to your other?
No, I don't transition from one to the other. I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and she said to me, they're just two separate activities. You've either got your haiku hat on or you've got your poetry hat on. Don't mix them up. And the haiku state of mind is different from the poetry state of mind.
When you were, are you prepared to read a poem now?
Yes, indeed.
Good.
What's tended to happen is that my poetry has been influenced by my haiku. And lots of haiku writers have been influenced by the Imagist poets like William Carlos Williams. And it's the simple form without lots of abstraction, the truth being in things. And this poem I'm going to read is from The Chatter of Crows. It's called The Old Woman, the Arthritic Dog, and the Cock Pheasant. An old woman walks through the countryside with her arthritic dog. She moves slowly, leaning on a stick, but stops frequently to let him catch up. They round a corner and see a cock pheasant close to the path. It is spring and a blackbird sings. The sky darkens and rain begins to fall. There is nothing more or less than this. And so I do not seek to explain it or to give it meaning. It is spring, it is raining, and there an old woman, an arthritic dog, and a cock pheasant.
Thank you. Anyone who loves poetry will love that. The visual image of all of that is right there for us. And I just think that if we all had the time to sit, I feel like everyone can write poetry if they want to. It may not be, using every device or that kind of thing, but if it's sincere and it is a visual moment, I think it's worthy of writing down as a poem. And I know people will argue with me. There should be, a form, or there should be all these standards, but I don't agree. Some of the best poems that I've read, or heard, I should say, have been at the local open mics where someone who is not calling themselves a poet will just put out something that just knocks everyone flat. And I love that. When you were editor of Blythe Spirit magazine, because we all want to know how to get published, and Borderlines, did you have something in particular you looked for in the work that came in?
I certainly did. What I was looking for is what we all spend our lives looking for all the time. My mother used to say, I'm not sure what I'm looking for, but I'll know when I find it. And what I'm looking for is that piece of writing that makes me go, wow. That just makes me feel excited, interested. I want a poem a haiku or a poem, which is fresh and original. I'm looking for something and they can't be all this at the same time. I'm looking for a poem that is inspiring, something that lifts me up. I'm looking for something which is insightful, something which is moving. All those things I'm looking for, and they're summarized by wow. And sometimes I'll see a haiku, and it's not really strictly, absolutely true to the form. But wow, if it makes me feel like that, it goes in. Because if it makes me feel like that, it'll make the reader feel like that. And that's what I want, a magazine where people go, wow, oh my gosh, wow, oh my gosh. I want it, yeah. I don't want
to tire them all out.
I don't want a dull journal or magazine, no.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm looking for.
I know what you mean. And I think that's a great explanation of how you choose things that go in journals. And I've had that experience reading different journals where I've said wow out loud, and it applies to haibun as well as haiku and senryu, because I'm mostly a senryu writer. But do you want to read another?
let me give you an example. Okay,
Okay.
the sort of thing that goes, wow. This is from your book, Three Lines at a Time, Vera Constantineau. And something that made me go, wow, was full moon. The baby turns under her hand. And I just went, wow, I think, and so much in there that there's the image of the moon, the curvature, the roundness of the moon, and the curvature and roundness of the woman's pregnant body. There's the mystery of the moon and the mystery of the whole idea of um, conception and pregnancy and childbirth. And then there's this wonderfulness of the idea of Earth Mother and that sort of wonderful interplay between the moon and the Earth. So all encapsulated in what is essentially, as you say, 3 lines at a time. Another one that I particularly liked of yours, which made me go, wow, was stones in my shoe, all those things we never said. And you've got, I know that because I go walking frequently, and sometimes you just get that little stone in your shoe, and it irritates you. You keep thinking, no, I'll keep walking, I can maybe move it sideways or whatever. But it's like in a long-term relationship, those things that were never said are like that. They 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 irritate, but you don't mention them. You hide them away. So what I'm looking for, Vera, is the sort of stuff you write, the
Oh,
wow moment.
and I did not set him up to say that.
She certainly didn't.
No,
She
thank you
didn't.
very much, though.
Yeah. Uh,
Um, I had a similar experience with your poetry. Now we're going to have one of those kumbaya moments, I guess. But in your epistolic poetry, I really love the letter and the response that you have written in The Chatter of Crows. And I suggest that anyone who loves poetry look at Office Press and think about buying that book because it's fantastic. Um, do you have a project you're currently working on?
yeah, I've currently just, well, it's almost finished. I have a project which is quite exciting. It's an arts council project organized by a local poet called Jean Atkin. And I've been writing poetry to accompany archive film. And I picked a ballroom, well, you call them dance halls in America, I think, where it showed people coming into the dance hall and then dancing. And I wrote a poem to accompany that. Another thing I've done recently is to produce a haiku sequence to go in an anthology called In the Sticks. Does that In the Sticks mean the countryside in America as well? Does it? In the Sticks. In the Sticks means rural areas.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a haiku sequence there. And I've got a personal project at the moment, which may sound a bit odd, but I've recently just walked up 10 significant hills. I won't call them mountains, hills in Shropshire. And at the top of each hill, or near the top of each hill, I've written a haiku, and I call them site-specific haiku. And then I've written them on leaves or twigs or stones, and then I've cast them out into the landscape. And the final walk we did was on a place called Heath Mynd, and we had a 360-degree view all around. And I found a stone there. Do you call it lichen in America? That yeah.
Yeah.
And this was a lichen-covered stone. And so on this stone, I wrote, "In all directions, the Shropshire hills, lichen on a stone." And then I picked the stone up and threw it out into the scrub on the hillside.
Hmm.
Uh, so it's the haiku writer should be self-effacing and being a neutral observer of life, and I thought, well, that's the ultimate self-effacement to write haiku and cast it away. But on the other hand, it's not self-effacement when you read it for hundreds of people to listen to on a podcast.
Yeah. Well,
But,
I think, though, we are all in a position of offering these things out for inspiration to other people to maybe do the same thing. Take that moment
yeah.
and think about where you are and what you're doing and what you're seeing or hearing even. And that was a wonderful idea. I may steal that.
What I've done is actually I've photographed all the twigs and things I've written the poems on, and the locations. And I'm starting to produce sheets with the grid reference, and put the photographs and the haiku all together on a page. But
Great.
I think it's a work in progress. A work in progress.
Well, those works in progress, they can go on and on.
Yeah.
Do you want to close us off with a poem? Because we're almost out of time.
Yeah. Okay. I will read a poem which I like myself, which is called Chair. And a chair is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as a chair is a separate seat for one person, typically with a back and four legs. And what I've done is define a chair by saying what it isn't. And for people in America, a rook is a black bird like a crow, and a pike is a freshwater fish. I don't know whether you use those in
We
America.
have pike. We don't have rook that I know of. I looked it up.
Okay.
And for the record, this may be North America, but we are located in Canada now.
Okay. Okay. A chair on a shelf is not a book, and a chair in a field is not a rook. A chair on a path is not a bike, and a chair in a lake is not a pike. A chair on a hill is not a rock, and a chair on a wall is not a clock. A chair in an egg is not a yolk, and a chair in a wood is not an oak. A chair in a hive is not a bee, and a chair in a door is not a key. A chair on a plate is not a dish, and a chair on a wand is not a wish, because a chair is a chair is a chair, be it here, there, or anywhere.
Thank you. And I have to say, that one is quickly becoming one of my favorites too. I've heard it more than once now, and I do admire that one. The first time I heard it, I had to really dig in on it, and I do love it. The other thing I love is your grandfather's story, but maybe we will talk at another time in the future. So thank you for coming today, David. It was wonderful to talk to you and hear your poetry again.
It's been a great pleasure, Vera, an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. That's it, listeners, for this first International PL podcast. Thanks for listening. And you know what I always say, write something. It feels good. Bye for now.